Hello everyone, today we talk about the Saka in the Achaemenid army. We talked about the Saka in other videos, the Eurasian steppes warfare series, mostly discussing the creation of cataphract warfare as a reaction to the defeat inflicted on them by Alexander the Great. There is a wide history of this peoples that we will define better now. We talked, I think, about the Sakai somewhere else, I'm sure. However, this is the first video we dedicate fully to them, and of course there will be others. The Hellenes often use the word Scythian to broadly categorize various groups of people sharing cultural and geographical connections. Similarly, the Achaemenid Persians employed the term Saka, as referenced in Herodotus 761, possibly representing the name of a significant tribe at the beginning that, however, came to encompass the entirety of the Scythian populations. The etymology of the term Saka stems from Old Persian, linked to a root meaning to roam, fittingly describing the nomadic lifestyle of these steppe dwellers. The reason why we cover the Sakai, you can use both, in the series about the Achaemenid army is that this people was definitely one of the most prominent foreign groups within the Achaemenid military. We encountered them here and there. That's the other video in which we discussed them, the Battle of Marathon. Right, we will talk about that later, but you've seen how Saka forces were present during the first invasion of Greece. And this is a military historical unit episode, so technically we're looking at arms and armor, but I thought that the Saka, of course, are worth sort of framing, especially in such an early period, not like also later times we know too much more about them or differently from this one, but in sort of a more broader anthropological, geographical, cultural sense, of course always connected with the military theme. If we were to brutally simplify, really, the Sakai horsemen, mirroring the Sakai foot soldiers, utilized the composite bow as their primary weapon. Although absent from Herodotus' army list, that is, the comprehensive catalogue of the forces that King Xerxes assembled for his invasion of Greece in 480, we made videos already from that list, as it contains also arms and armor descriptions, sometimes in a very sketchy fashion, but this is literally all what we know about certain people's warfare of the era. Some tribes are somehow lost otherwise to history. Aside from this, historical records portray the Sakai as the most fearsome cavalry force during the same Persian wars, but also in other circumstances. It's kind of obvious as you understand what these peoples were about in their fundamentals, hence the Eurasian steppes warfare playlist, but we all know that these were Central Asian nomadic tribesmen, right? And they had been pioneering and championing equestrian military culture from the top of their magnificent, actually heavenly mounts in ways that no other people had developed up to that point. It's not like centuries cavalry sucked, but in general they were historically derived, even since the times of chariot warfare, from, in fact, Central Asian, at that point, war chariots. I made a video how cavalry, let's say horsemanship, was born for military purposes, and also how the, say, cavalry narrowly meant detached from the initial chariotry had come about in the meanwhile. In fact, when you look at this first millennium BC, you realize that cavalry was even fairly young, and that the Achaemenids, in part, as you know, were fundamentally descending from the Medians. They were historically Scythians themselves. I made videos about Achaemenid cavalry, and we will keep talking about that. In any case, these connections, like across Eurasia, Western and Eastern as well, we've seen it also for Chinese warfare, were crucial because the medium, right, at least of this mounted military standards, were set by these populations. All right, and if we look at 480 invasion of Greece, it's likely that the Sakai were incorporated into the Achaemenid 5th Corps, sharing a system analogous to their infantry peers, and that are at times also documented, and operating alongside the Bactrians. I made a video about the Bactrians and the Sogdians if you're interested in their warfare. These mobile fighters rode with saddles, but stirrups were not used in their mounted combat in general. You do not need them yet. I made a video about the genesis of the stirrup. It's spread across Eurasia from the Indo-Scythians to Charles Martel, so we'll look at these topics separately, more in depth at some point. But this is fundamentally the warlike people that we're discussing today. And let's look at them in a bit more in-depth way through this Achaemenid lens, because of course the Persians at this point embodied the universal empire over most of Western Eurasia. And as you know, the Persia in general, this is valid also for later Persian empires and dynasties, had a very sort of blurred frontier with the nomadic steppes that, as we've seen, were essentially great part of the protagonists ruling over the same Persia in historical perspective, and that continued fueling the Persian military, providing with this sort of more combative, brutal, primitive dimension. It was, of course, very effectively vehiculated by the more sophisticatedly civilized armies, like you could see the Persian one at some point. We've made more videos about the various ethnic groups fighting as allies, subject, auxiliaries, etc. in the Achaemenid army than the regular Achaemenid army, so to say, itself. But I promise we will get there. In any case, we talked about also the Herodotus army list, for that matter. I made a video completely dedicated to Xerxes' order of battle in 480. Now, when you look at the Sakai, you also get this sense of generic definition, because of course it's very complicated by the mid-millennium BC to define exactly what these Sakai really were. We use the same term employed by the Persians, a bit like the Scythian one for the Greeks, exactly in that only relative vagueness due essentially to two issues. First of all, these peoples were all very similar to one another. They were, again, very primitive, nomadic, and as a consequence, second point, they did not essentially write. So in this sense, it's not much the fact that the Achaemenids or the Hellenes did not know in depth about them. They traded with them, they fought with them, that there is hardly greater hybridizer or also potential destroyer, or both at the same time for that matter, historically wise. However, it's mostly our own problem. Like, we, of course, do not live in the same time of the Sakai. We can't go talk to them, and we have to rely on this more civilized people's written accounts and more, because there is also a lot of iconography. However, today we will look at also some the most famous archaeological findings of Sakai warriors to define better what these could have been, also and especially in Achaemenid employ. So the Sakai were a powerful assembly of nomadic tribes. Lots of people, all right? This is the peak of Indo-European dominance of the steppes. Basically, almost the entirety of the Eurasian steppes is controlled by the Indo-Europeans. What would become essentially the Turco-Mongols are relegated in the single most backwardly underdeveloped fringe in the very northeast of this space, and also heavily influenced by the Indo-Europeans, by the way. Of course, the Achaemenid Empire didn't even reach, let's say, the ideal central of Asia proper, so of course just a part of these peoples was concretely known by them. The Chinese would have known better about others. We will talk also about their perspective at a point. However, we also rely on, given the aforementioned homogeneity of these populations at large, on the, of course, on findings that exist further east, right, and that probably had a few to do with the Achaemenids in general, but we never have to give for granted this sort of apparent detachment just because we are devoid of enough information about that. Actually, steppe peoples were usually, just for their predatory and essentially fringe necessities, much better informed on the sedentary empires than the latter were of them. Simply because they were weaker, more unstable, they needed to loot, to raid in order to survive to begin with, and so they had to be pretty well informed about the sedentary civilizations. On the other hand, we give a bit too much for granted the almost complete homogeneity of steppes warfare. This is actually not correct. This is not just due to, of course, more or less the greater or smaller proximity to civilization, but also very different factors that are mostly political, cultural, also very environmentally connected, but not just geopolitics does not exist, but it's just like a deterministic nonsense, in fact, that has very little to do with the environment. It's sort of very weird how people understand geopolitics also as a pseudo-conservative idea, while it actually mirrors so many nonsense from sort of the environmentalistic BS. However, speaking an Iranian language, the Sakai were closely related to what were called Scythians in Europe, specifically those of Ukraine, the Pontic steppe, like north of the Black Sea, that were much better documented, chiefly by the Greeks that had colonies in Crimea. The Achaemenids, of course, had to do with those places because, as you know, the Persians invaded the Pontic steppe, fighting against the Scythians, and they actually didn't get much out of that. I described that expedition in an old video that I made on Scythian warfare at large. We will come back on that, but if you're interested also in sort of Sakai warfare so far, that's yet another chapter you can check out. The languages and cultural practices of the Scythians and the Sakai, assuming we can split them, because they would have not really been conceived like that. They would have, of course, been split in many other subgroups, but fundamentally they were the same peoples. It's like trying too hard to split, I don't know, the Scythians from the Sarmatians, or even within the latter, the Alani, depending on how we want to categorize them. It doesn't make much sense. These were peoples that had all sprung out of Central Asia, some of the sort of most primitive and sort of metaphysical sacred areas of the world, and at different waves had basically overrun those who had sort of softened up, gentrified, and the outskirts. And this is basically the eternal history of the steppes until basically Europeans took everything over in the modern age. Now, the languages and cultural practices of, again, the Scythians and the Sakai were thus largely similar. And Herodotus, in Book 7, Chapter 64 of his history, indicates that the Sakai was the Persian term used for all Scythian tribes. The territory of the Saka extended from the Ural Mountains to the edges of Mongolia. We can approximate this separation on the basis of this orographic divide, but again, at large, of course, there were important differences, but we're talking about fundamentally the same people. Persia primarily engaged with the western factions of this space. Nevertheless, significant archaeological discoveries in Saka regions further east are primarily the Issyk Kurgan near Lake Balkhash and Pazyryk in the Altai Mountains, shedding light on the Saka's equipment within the realm of the Achaemenid Empire. The Issyk Kurgan is an ancient burial mound nestled in southeastern Kazakhstan. Discovered in 1969, this site has captivated archaeologists and historians alike due to its most famous inhabitant, the so-called Golden Man or Golden Princess, whose burial was adorned with thousands of gold ornaments showcasing not only wealth but also the military significance of the deceased. We will talk at some point about the Amazonian cycle, about warrior maidens in Iranian, broader Indo-European culture. In any case, the array of artifacts including a dagger, Akinaka's sword, this is essentially a very sturdy dagger with very anti-armor function, and armor scales, in fact, alongside a silver bowl with inscriptions in what is believed to be a Scythian dialect, provides a rare glimpse into the life and martial practices of these ancient warriors. Dating back to the 5th to 4th centuries BC, the Issyk Kurgan, as you know, is essentially an artificial mound that worked as at least the burial place of the second, so the clanic one. I explained in the traditional view of the afterlife and the various destiny of the different souls, has become a symbol of Kazakhstan's cultural heritage, illuminating the complex society of the Sakas, where warfare, art, and perhaps literacy intertwined, offering invaluable insights into the Iron Age of Central Asia. The Pazyryk burials in the Altai mountains of Siberia represent the series of archaeological sites that have provided profound insights into the lives of these ancient nomads. These Kurgan burials discovered in the 20th century are notable for their exceptional preservation due to the permafrost, which has kept organic materials like tattoos, textiles, and even foodstuffs intact over millennia. These tombs, dating from the 5th to 2nd centuries BC, reveal the rich tapestry of Pazyryk's culture, art, technology, and social system. The Pazyryk people were skilled horsemen and warriors, as evidenced again by the array of weapons found, including bows, arrows, and swords, alongside horse gear like saddles and bridles, which indicate advanced horsemanship. Of course, the preservation of these materials is rare, to the point of allowing us to see the intricate tattoos that adorn the bodies, depicting animals and mythical creatures, suggesting a deep cultural connection, of course, with the natural world, and surely spiritual military practices that we documented in the videos about the Indo-European sacred war bands. Some Achaemenid inscriptions reference three categories of Saka subjects: the Saka beyond the sea, which points to the European Scythians, so beyond essentially the Black Sea, rather than actual Persian subjects, even their defeat of Darius I. Let's remember that Darius invaded European Scythia in 513, and he had gotten nowhere with that. Then the Saka Hauma Varga, known as drinkers of the sacred Auma, and also referred to by Herodotus as the Amyrgian Scythians, and the Saka Tigrak Hauda, identified as, quote, those with pointed hats, like you can see also in this find, that likely reflects that headgear style. The specific locations of the two latter groups, by the way, remain uncertain. Right, when the Persians spoke of the Saka beyond the sea, as we've seen, they refer to the Scythians north of the Black Sea, using specifically Paradrayad, that means, in fact, beyond the sea, indicating their distant and, in fact, at large non-subject status after especially defeating Darius I. At large, what was a subject in front of the Universal Empire is difficult to discuss. We will surely make a video just to set the premises for debating this topic. You can argue that the Hellenes were within the Achaemenid Empire even without the Achaemenid invasion of Greece, before especially the Persian wars that definitely unlocked a bit more of Hellenic power, to say the least, against their, in fact, former overlords. The Saka Hauma Varga As we've seen, the Amurgian Scythians derived their name from the ritualistic use of the Auma. This was a sacred psychoactive plant. We will look at this better in a dedicated video about the Indo-European meaning of Iranian religion. This was essentially the sacred Soma. And Varga means group, right? Hence, drinkers of the sacred Auma, collectively, right? Lastly, the Saka Tigra Cauda are named, as we've seen, after their distinctive headgear, and Tigra means pointed, and Cauda relates to head. Thus, those with pointed heads, reflecting a cultural marker, perhaps a distinctive tribe within a broader Saka confederation. Each name thus offers a glimpse into how these groups were categorized, at least by the Achaemenids, based on geography, cultural practices, or distinct attire. Inscriptions from Darius mention also the Saka of the marshlands and Saka of the plains, which may correspond to the same two groups, but with different titles. In fact, inscriptions in Egyptian hieroglyphs from Darius the Great, specifically those at the Suez Canal, mention the Saka of the marshlands and the Saka of the plains. It's possible that these could have been respectively the Saka Hauma Varga and Saka Tigra Cauda, essentially reinforcing how the Achaemenids categorized these nomadic peoples based on their habitat or perhaps their known territories. However, linking these names definitely to other known Saka groups involves some scholarly speculation, and especially they do not really correspond to any specific territorial reality that we can simply identify from a geographical, environmental point of view. So we could think that, I don't know, the Saka of the marshlands were the ones inhabiting the great Ukrainian and Russian rivers, even the Danube in the west as a boundary, while the Saka of the plains were from the plateaus, the highlands of Central Asia. This is speculative. It's, however, an interpretation, because we don't think there was here something much narrower than major regional repartitions that could be an explanation. Hellenic historical accounts suggest that Cyrus the Great fell to the Massagetai in battle against them. The Massagetai were, as you know, a formidable Saka confederation recognized by Herodotus and subsequent Hellenic historians, also akin to the Sarmatians that would have emerged in later history, citing Ctesias of Cnidus, an Hellenic physician and historian from Caria that at the time was part of the Achaemenid Empire. Cyrus had managed to conquer the Saka king Amorgus, which names the Saka Aumavarga, likely contributing 20,000 troops to Cyrus's final campaign in 530 BC. This is a pretty large amount of troops. We are likely talking about a wide majority of horse archers. We will see this better now, especially in such a wide frontier area at the fringe of the same steppes that would have also facilitated the employment of such essentially local troops. This indicates, by the way, that the Saka Haumavarga were situated relatively close to the Achaemenid border, as they were subdued before Cyrus faced the Massagetai. We do not understand too well whether, again, such forces sound regional in scale, so it's possible that we're talking about major pools of recruitment from the side of these rulers, whose political relation with the Achaemenid Empire we will analyze in a while. Naturally, the sources can be relatively unreliable. These are, of course, substantial numbers, but they may have been less in general, especially talking about relatively far away places, distant frontiers, especially from sources coming from the opposite end of this universe. We can't see too clearly. Nevertheless, we understand here that was a regional or at least provincial ruler that did side with the Achaemenids for the obvious infights that existed among the Sakai. Especially, we can presume at this point, just within the original space bordering the Achaemenid Empire itself. Later, Darius engaged in war with King Shunka of the Saka Tigrakau, that likely resided further away and may have been associated with the same Massagetai. Additionally, Xerxes included the Daha or Dai in the roster of subject Saka peoples. Darius' campaign against King Skunka of the Saka Tigrakau is documented in the Beistun inscription, where Darius claims to have captured Skunka and subdued his people. This event took place around 519 BC, indicating that the Saka Tigrakau were located in a region relatively distant from the Persian heartland, and possibly in this case closer to what we approximately call Central Asia proper. By the way, Xerxes, a couple of generations later, included the Daha or Dahai in the roster of Saka subject peoples. Xerxes, following Darius, continued to assert control over the same Sakai regions. In his inscriptions, particularly at Persepolis, he lists the Daha or Dahai among the subject peoples of the Saka, suggesting a further extension of Achaemenid influence or recognition of these groups within the empire's administrative framework. These inclusion might reflect either military campaigns or diplomatic arrangements to integrate or acknowledge these tribes under Achaemenid rule, showcasing the ongoing efforts to manage and expand the empire's northern and eastern frontiers. However, specific details about Xerxes' campaigns against these groups are less documented, focusing more on his attempts to consolidate and expand Achaemenid control in other areas. The degree of Achaemenid control over major Saka tribes appears to have, in fact, been limited. The Persians were a sedentary civilization, even though they were strongly rooted in a religious, spiritual, and even military steppes originary legacy. They could have not ruled an empire of that magnitude and stability had they simply remained in the steppes. However, as we were pointing out before, and we've seen also in other videos, the northeastern frontier of the Achaemenid Empire was pretty blurred, as we're talking tendentially less civilized areas in northeastern Iran. Most of Persian civilization rests in the west, close to Mesopotamia, having many interesting strategic opportunities to operate from. So whatever happened in the northeastern frontier is relatively less relevant, especially considering again that you're not facing a single unitary competitor. You have lots of different tribes that routinely fight against one another and that you already exert a certain degree of control on, that you can turn one against the other, essentially making them fight for those pastures that in part you may have granted them in the more fringe areas that are still like gold for them compared to the bowels of the steppes. However, having always this problem that the guys, in fact, that living in Central Asia are hungrier, angrier, and in this sense more warlike, more desperate, tendentially managing to break through more often than not, at least against their still nomadic counterparts. That is, routinely, as the Achaemenid Empire, you have to intervene to tame the more quarrelsome entities and are trying to co-opt their leaders at the expense of other groups that he has previously led at the same time. So this thing goes over and over. But definitely the fact that Achaemenid royalty could fall in combat against the Saka is quite telling about the overall dangers and stakes that such invasions just provided. Historical evidence suggests that Darius' interaction with the Saka following his military victories involved the installation of a new king rather than the imposition of direct governance. Because again, there wasn't even much of an administrative framework to simply replicate in the steppes. It was mostly a clientelarly, quasi-vassalitic relation. that the Sakas engaged in with the Persians. Of course, including tributes, as we'll see now also, and especially in military contingents that would have served at the four corners of the empire. Imagery from Persepolis, such as the depiction of Saka throne bearers adorned with torques reminiscent of Arab rulers, but not for the Turks, provides further insight. This Persian art is a bit stereotypical. There are, as you know, different peoples represented, however, just with slight difference in clothing, in look, and so on. We will talk about, of course, the Persepolis reliefs. Considering that Arabs were a client state ruled by their own king, this imagery may indicate a similar relationship between the Persians and the Saka, thus assimilating them to the Arabs by the degree of political connection. Of course, the Saka were Indo-Europeans, the Arabs were Semites, implying an alliance or client status with their great king. So it's mostly like the place owned in this representation in relation with the kings of kings, rather than, of course, any resemblance. Of course, these peoples living within fundamentally the Achaemenid sphere of influence, at least, did not enormously differ in terms of just outward attire, especially dress. Mostly they differ in terms of equipment. Now we will look at the Saka one in detail, but that's yet another source you wanna consider overall, especially as far as the political role right within the empire was concerned. The Saka soldiers within the Achaemenid military were recognized, categorized as allies or mercenaries, rather than subjects obligated to provide levies. This is at least what some scholar believes, wanting to stress, of course, the fact that these steppe nomads were freer than other sedentary peoples that could simply be more easily subjected and simply convinced just by the more civilized lifestyle to bond with this greater overlord to, at the end of the day, also grow within the empire. Was this successful in its endeavors, otherwise rebelling for that matter? You couldn't really control the Sakas of the steppes too much or for too long. They were more unstable systems. They underwent pretty strong political upheaval. So they were a puzzle for everybody involved. I mean, we talk steppes, politics and warfare from many perspectives. Think about Byzantine history. You have there a beautiful manual to the entire sort of difficulty, to say the least, to trying to manage the umpteenth people come from the steppe that you use to essentially take out the other that is oppressing you, and that becomes the same in the same way. Now, although the majority of Saka cavalry were light horse archers, some were heavily armored. This is the most basic steppe horseman organic typology segmentation. There is all a reason for this, essentially, that aforementioned instability does not bring a great deal of social homogeneity as well. At least there are these hegemonic tribes that manage to subject the others, that is expressed by the collection of most of their wealth. Thus, the central people, we've seen this archaeological find, for example, replete in gold, etc. There we're looking at, especially for steppe standards and in a very sort of northeastern Asian location, an overwhelming, a traumatically enormous amount of wealth that, of course, was exacted by a pretty large amount of population that could produce that surplus that notoriously in the steppe is practically non-existent, if not through raiding, which means that these other subjects, sort of second category peoples, go at war fundamentally naked, without armor, as horse archers, just with their coats that provide some kind of padded protection, but at large these are light troops. That's also the reason why they fight just as missile, because they literally do not have the means, not just to equip themselves with heavier equipment, and thus also with heavier mounts, that require vast pastures that are in fact just enjoyed by the royal clans, those that provided ultra heavy elite armored cavalry, that it individually is superior, in fact, even to the one of the steppes, but that especially in fact cannot afford as horse archers that same lifestyle, just to practice, like to train with those arms and armor. And so at times entire tribes are exterminated, displaced, scattered, and many of them of course are reabsorbed into other hegemonic groups as slaves, as wives. Typically you scalp your enemy, you kill his children, and you take their women, or at least maybe the children are maintained, but in a slave condition. The woman, of course, in this is subordinated, at least especially if it is from enemy, if she's being taken from defeated peoples. Regarding, again, the importance of female figures in Scythian warfare, there is a lot to say, except in the actual practice of how many women would actually have that lifestyle. Of course, a very contained one, to say the least. Not because some of them could have not been, but because, of course, their societal role was unavoidably tied to their identity, to their essence, and to the role they had to primarily perform, of course, as the bearers of the new generation of warriors. And even if some of them were, of course, radically savage, brutal, and primitive, to be able to wield a weapon, etc., like this does not, of course, allow for their substitution. Even just think about their bodily, physical limitation compared to man, into the traumatically and radically probably single most violent scenario in the entire world at the time. So always evaluate, of course, traditional wisdom and hierarchical roles, as there is definitely not much to blip around about that. In any case, when you look at Achaemenid authority and how they portray themselves, regardless of their shortcomings in the more fringe areas, it's not like the Sakas were simply considered as peers or enjoyed necessarily as a whole a greater status than other peoples per se. On the contrary, as we said before, these were sort of poor, less developed realities that lived in the steppes exactly because they couldn't afford to break through the sedentary world, unlike some of their descendants later on. Think about the Parthians, etc., or say more fortunate elements, just like the Achaemenids had historically been, as a part again of Scythian waves that took over the Middle East. The point being, however, that the Achaemenids did recognize very clearly the Indo-European nobiliar ethos and value system to attribute, at least to the leaders of these populations, that respect stemming from their militarized lifestyle, their objectively impressive individual capacities, both as leaders but also as warriors, that thus brought their, say, military interaction, also as auxiliaries within the Achaemenid army, into sort of more elevated roles, right? These were, for example, peoples that knew how to make war across thousands of kilometers. Logistically, it's not a few, right? If you have, say, sort of warlike populations in the Anatolian hinterland, yes, they can be useful as medium mountaineer infantry or so, but it's not like they had the political, societal structure to systematically wage war in large organized armies, thousands of kilometers to be generous, mostly the hundreds. First of all, because even in the latter case, they would have been steamrolled by the Achaemenids, who controlled Iran and Iraq to a degree that was enough to hegemonize, in fact, a great part of Western Eurasia in the process. But in fact, because also they didn't need, obviously, but because they didn't have properly the cultural background and moral mindset to be able to do that. Saka tribes, their leaders, definitely knew how to organize such expeditions, and therefore also how to contribute in general to the Achaemenid force that, as you know, relied quite importantly on cavalry as well. They had maintained this shock element centrality in their warfare, regardless of how, of course, infantry could not already at this point be simply bypassed. Like, their combined arm system was, for example, much more advanced than the Hellenic one. Even during the Persian wars, classical Greece relied essentially on a mono-arm system. That's the reason why they didn't take over the world, unlike Alexander did when he inherited from his father a combined armed system that in fact has nothing to do with the Hellenic phalanx, regardless of how people conceive the Macedonian one. And that's also relevant because the same Saka cavalry, as I was saying at the beginning, and I discussed in that video about Eurasian steppes warfare, will develop the cataphract solution exactly to cope with the heavy Macedonian infantry, was much tougher than the plethora of Achaemenid forces. I made a video recently about the late Achaemenid army development, especially after the Persian wars, or starting from 480 at least, observing how they tried essentially to put together something more performing, especially against Hellenic hoplites that were swarming the Achaemenid Empire, even just as mercenaries during the same Persian civil wars. But they didn't have it in that case, in fact, the societal background to allow that. Also, the Achaemenid Empire was very positive, very strong. It crushed many autonomies. Well, the Sakas did not have much of this problem per se, and they could contribute, given their particular international role, to the Achaemenid war efforts. They were sort of pressed into, admittedly, because of their dire straits out there in the steppes. However, from the standpoint of chivalry, of knighthood, of nobility, that at this point these peoples really embody in a beautiful way, in a wonderful, probably in a likable way. It's possible that the Achaemenid use of horse armor that we documented in a military historical unit episode was inspired by the same Massagetic cavalry, known for employing both horse and personal armor as evidence as late as the Battle of Gaugamela. We'll talk about it. But if you think about great commanders like Bessus, coming from these essentially Iranian, also barely civilized at some point, let's say still in the steppe frontier context, like, you realize that they really were a knightly culture. They were developing further in that direction. Again, horsemanship, as far as the development of a fully autonomous cavalry arm, was just some centuries old, right? Cavalry, as we intended, did not exist. They were single horsemen, but the idea of having them enough drilled, supplied, trained, motivated, politically, societally kept together to provide this military force was something very recent, right? Before that, chariot warfare was sort of the way to go. When we talk about mounted units, it was always a combined armed system. Here, as you understand, the mounted elite goes together with the horse archers missile element. These peoples, by the way, had developed cavalry earlier than, say, Mesopotamia. And again, I made multiple videos about some of these populations, also from the Persian plateau, that were themselves very chivalric, very Western in their own profile, especially compared to Mesopotamian civilization, but they were not as advanced as the steppes wars. I made a video about the Manayan warrior, for example. The Manayans were people just inhabiting western Iran at the beginning of the first millennium BC, and you want to consider them in this picture as essentially an extension also of that Saka, for how it was defined military culture. Herodotus' description of the Saka infantry in Xerxes' army portrays them as lightly armed, equipped with a bow, Achaemenid, and a sagaris. The Achaemenid, as we have seen, as it's notorious, this Scythian symmetric knife/dagger, very useful against armor that you would find in this, of course, knightly dominated contexts. Of course, like just other knights usually were again armored enough to engage into basically wrestling with that short weapon. Of course, they had swords, they had spears, etc. But when they got into that rougher hand-to-hand fighting with equally armored troops, the sagaris is an axe. It's also warhammer. It depends. Mostly the sagaris is depicted as an axe, but there were also other anti-armor weapons that, in this sense, are very useful in this context. Infantry exists in the steppes. These troops are not just subjected, semi-sedentary or semi-nomadic, depending on how you want to see it, peoples that the Saka subjected. They do exist, especially in that aforementioned frontier between Persia and Central Asia. However, there are, of course, aside from the Saka dismounted troops, some actual nomads that live also more sedentary lifestyle and or can and will go at war, maybe mounted but dismount when fighting, and or that can be drilled, mustered literally as foot levies. This is relevant because in the steppes you will find islands of such populations, sometimes not even among the least developed ones of the steppes. The steppes do not exclusively oblige you to live as a nomad. It only makes it sort of more viable, more useful. Of course, the life of these more sedentary populations was not that thrilling at large, considering the surroundings, but they were in part just the same of their neighbors, right? So in at a broader civilizational level, so to say. This is interesting because, of course, especially in the areas closer to the Achaemenid Empire, there would be some greater level of agriculturalism, of more sedentary settlement, and it would be easy, even for properly ethnic Saka communities, to fight on foot with large amounts of troops, relatively to their otherwise more sort of equestrian-based background, and to, in fact, adopt some Achaemenid military styles as well. In fact, what we don't get too clearly often, also in the development of steppes warfare, is that when we see particular knightly arms and armor, so horse armor, etc., we don't have to think that this is something generated in the steppes. Yes, there is a level of feudalism. In order to maintain strong cavalry, you must, of course, own a lot of wealth, and at large some of these chieftains will surely have very well armored retinues, but these earlier times are, again, later sagas are definitely heavier. The cataphract here technically does not exist yet, right? So the world is younger, there is less material wealth that is being exploited, that also these guys frankly need in order to fight, right? When you look at the happening of sort of Saka warfare, you realize that there is a process of gradual settlement, of gentrification, of fortification, that in fact before the Turkic waves from the far northeast of Asia had almost developed a feudal society, where it was wiped out eventually by those waves, that however you can find later on in Turco-Mongolian history, still especially in the West, in Western Eurasia, very influenced by the Indo-European legacy. Think about the Khazars. We've seen these peoples again in Western, in Eurasian Steppes Warfare series. We dedicated specifically to this. erecting massive fortresses, settling, right? Having a landed power, more permanent, more stable profile. Of course, just by steppes standards, because at large they never abandoned nomadism. When you understand that Herodotus describes the same Saka infantry as equipped with basically the same weapons that the cavalry used, you understand that, of course, we're talking about troops that were not too different even from other populations that the Achaemenids control in large swaths. For example, the Achaemenid, right? These were people, as you know, between the Iranian plateau and the Caspian Sea. So they were just literally next to the steppes. They were perennially invested by the nomads, but they are an example of largely foot troops. This is what in later times during Islamic invasions, the Achaemenids, for example, will stem from. And these troops seem to be, in fact, very well capable of coping with the steppes raiders, because in a way the steppes raiders, as we said before, weren't even that much at a larger scale, right? They were too fragmented, too quarrelsome. So conversely, like this more sedentary populations could arm themselves and cope with them, also countering their horse archery with bows, using more or less the same kind of weapons. It's not like they were even too different from them, either ethnically or just even in their way of war, right? But they were balanced in a different way, because in the steppe they naturally live in a way, and in the sedentary world you live in another. Achaemenid art also illustrates similar light archers, potentially of Saka origin. Having lots of archers, of course, is the best way at that point to cope with enemy horse archers. They're cheaper, at least at large. They don't have to maintain the horse, so you can have plenty of them. That will actually not be superior to cavalry in open ground, if not when supporting and being supported by the same. However, when settlements were attacked, like ring forts, Wagenburgs, we talked about this also recently for the Hussites, but as you know, it was a millenary tradition, really, especially coming from the steppes. You could, of course, even as dismounted cavalry men, you would at that point shoot the bow from a safer, more sheltered position. So it's a mix, really. There aren't just cavalrymen. That's what eventually leads the way and opens one also across this infantries. But these are tough, right? These are rough and tough. They emerged from roughly the same environment, and they knew how to take on cavalry. They were quite simple at the time. Here we don't see it really, but there were wider shields that were, of course, against arrow fire. Fairly long lances. There were these spear walls that could keep raiders out from your backyard, from your fortified settlements, etc. But of course, it's a very degraded and disastered sedentary civilization that has to cope routinely with this incursions, manifesting essentially its own weakness. As we've seen at the Battle of Marathon against the Hellenes, Saka infantry performed with distinction alongside Achaemenid footmen at the center of the line. So the very best heavy infantry, successfully penetrating Athenian hoplites at some point, breaking effectively the Hellenic center, which is exactly what would point out how the Achaemenids did not even lack, of course, substantial heavy infantry to employ against the Greeks, and even overwhelming them. At least the Athenian center was thinner, so that break was somehow expectable. But the Athenians break, and their allies break the Achaemenid wings, and they managed to essentially envelope the Achaemenids. It was probably like a very messy situation for both sides. However, I just recently made a video about that battle. You can check that out. This tells you, however, that the same Sakas were capable of fighting dismounted with great effect, wielding pretty imposing weapons and having, in fact, this very warlike, also very physical, like very rough kind of role. At the Battle of Plataea, Xerxes, we'll have to talk about the Battle of Plataea, deployed Saka soldiers in the primary battle formation. Definitely, these peoples could provide with decent heavy infantry, to say the least, proving that they had it in their ranks, that they habitually fought with it regardless of the primacy of horsemen. The latter examples hint that the Saka infantry armament may have been more robust than what Herodotus' relatively stereotypical account suggests. However, of course, we don't have any evidence of some sort of widespread use of particularly heavy infantry from the Sakas. In general, of course, their infantry would at large be lighter. Just some knights could even dismount to fight, again, depending on the tactical circumstances, but also the wish of the Achaemenids. Of course, if you had heavy cavalry to deploy with enough space and numbers, you would prefer such employment. But at large, one factor that could have played into this is the aforementioned youth of cavalry in some way, and also the need to stiffen, for example, the Achaemenid infantry lines against the tendentially heavier Hellenic ones, right? So that in some ways even the equestrian capacities of the Sakas may have been sacrificed for these more infantry purpose. Herodotus notes that the Massagetai possessed both spearmen and archers, which is absolutely plausible. I mean, everybody had, really. And a plaque from the Oxus treasure confirms that the Saka infantry utilized spears. Spearmen and archers would be, in the absence of cavalry, the best solution for countering the latter. Naturally, you had to have, as we just said, enough heavy infantry. That in this sense is not necessarily elite armored infantry, it's just, guys against the standard line against especially the lights, just like horse archers as well. So you need really a combined armed tactics from the side of the latter and the elite armored horsemen to take these guys out. Otherwise, this is what those aforementioned sedentary peoples in the French used to mostly counter these enemies, like, including the Achaemenids, by the way. Now we will explain better why. Just a word about the Oxus treasure. That is a very famous source. Remarkable collection of gold and silver objects from the Achaemenid Persian period, dating roughly to the 5th to 4th centuries BC. It was discovered in 1877 near, in fact, the Oxus River, that is the modern Amu Darya, what is now Tajikistan. It's one of the most significant archaeological finds from ancient Persia. The hoard includes over 170 items, votive plaques, figurines, jewelry, coins, and vessels crafted with incredible skill, showcasing the wealth and artistry of the Achaemenid Empire. Most of the Oxus treasure ended up in, would not explain here the whole thing. There is a lot also about horses, chariots as well. But in any case, it's famously today preserved in the British Museum after this wild journey involving bandits, merchants, and British officers from the time. Talking about all these shields, especially from the side of infantrymen that were not that heavily armored at large, and yet they had to cope with the hail arrows of Saka archers, it's conceivable that the same Achaemenids supplied the Sakas, also as a general precaution fighting other enemies like the Alains and more, with shields, or possible even Achaemenid spara. Where the spara was a type of shield used by the ancient Persians, characterized by its wickerwork construction, covered with hides or leather for added protection. It was notoriously large, rectangular, and portable, designed to be carried by soldiers as part of forming a shield wall or for individual protection during combat. Herodotus describes the spara as being used by Persian infantry, suggesting that it might have been distributed to or adopted by allied or subjugated groups like the Saka or Massagetai for similar tactical purposes. We'll talk more about the spara, but again, we have to discuss mostly the Achaemenid, so-called native Persian infantry. We know, of course, of other features of Saka armament. For example, the distinctive bronze three-barbed arrowheads, really characteristic of steppe nomads, are to be found across the Achaemenid Empire, both iconographically and archaeologically. The purpose of these arrowheads was actually hitting against a softer target. It was one which basically that could cut through you and remain hooked fundamentally and causing more infection because of the oxygenation of the wound that would be opened by these barbs. So that's also an indicator that at large there wasn't too much armor around, as it was completely normal considering the times, the places, even in such, again, the Achaemenid Empire is such an advanced military. It's the strongest military out there in Western Eurasia. The Sakas being poorer materially, having just excellent elite cavalry that is elite not just in quality but also in quantity. While some archaeological findings may represent the presence of Saka troops, there is minimal evidence to support the existence of Saka settlements or garrisons in a truly sedentary sense. I think there actually would have been some, at least settlements did exist, as we explained before, garrisons as well. This happened all over the steppes and other areas. This is particularly evident around, for example, lakes, like, I don't know, the Aral, one, the Caspian Sea. So think about the same Pontic steppe. There are so many, this is true also for later times, there are so many areas that these nomads would have fundamentally settled, right? The Pontic steppe was so good for many reasons, but that's also where people usually gentrified and took over and got taken over by more nomadic kins coming from the east. So in that sense, there is obviously a capacity to fortify, to control, especially the river mouths, the main trading posts, some caravan stations, oases. This would have existed. It would have been pretty scarce overall, but it would have been present. If anything, even the nomadic settlements, I mean, moving with the wagons, with the tents, with the, of course, on pastures where you could bring your cattle, the fresher resources, highly coveted across the steppes and fought over by the same guys, entailed the endemic concentration of larger pools of sagas. In any case, it's likely that weaponry was in great part inspired by the Achaemenids themselves. I mean, the main designs, the most advanced notions that we will see in other videos about Scythian warfare, for example, they bought Hellenic armor, even though they fought in a completely different way. As you know, that has nothing to do with the replicating any kind of hoplitic tactics or whatever, even for foot-based military systems. It was just normal because at large also designs, crafts, etc. were just functional for the same purposes. As we've seen, the same sagas can and will fight on foot. And in any case, what you need as a protection, as a defense, is true both for mounted and foot combat, right? There aren't these radical differences. You can specialize, of course, certain designs, certain solutions, but aside from the optimal picture. In many ways, it's just a lot for you to have armor to begin with, and the Achaemenids would provide the best. Especially, of course, the elites would import such panoplies that would have tendentially been more outdated. In general, they got the cheaper ones, the one they would tend to treasure to reuse them. However, steppe peoples had also pretty advanced metallurgy on their own, so at large they could contribute themselves to that kind of practice. And again, when we talk about the Saka, we're talking about such a wide amount of people scattered across such an immense amount of territory that it's just like a bare indicator of all the various cultures out there, some being overwhelmingly primitive, but at the same time being very active and actually in contact with sedentary civilizations, also China from the other side. And again, we will talk more about this at some point. We talked about the Zhou dynasty, we'll talk about the Hans again, and as you know, the Chinese contact with the Central Asian peoples was quite intense, especially from a military point of view. Following Xerxes' campaign to Hellas, documentation of Saka troops is unfortunately scarce until the final Achaemenid-wise battle of Gaugamela. Babylonian records mention Saka soldiers who may have been military colonists from the Saka Atru, fulfilling various roles. These records, for instance, indicate that the Sakas were once responsible for managing ships transporting grain supplies, which may connect with the aforementioned logistical habit of organizing kilometers long journeys across the steppes, therefore understanding logistics very well. This may just be the example of some kind of career that some foreigners could make in more civilized areas. The Sakas were no mariners at large, but they could adapt, of course, elsewhere, so we don't really know. It's possible, however, in the specific case that Saka troops served as marines in Xerxes' forces in 480 BC. This wouldn't be so strange. After all, marines served as properly as heavy troops, like they would fight on land, right? So it was mostly, just think about Hellenic hoplites. Those were the marines of classical Greece. There was no difference whatsoever. They fought in the same, individually, especially in the same identical ways. So why should have not the Sakas participated to the Persian wars invest of basically any type of trooper? There's no reason. Tendentially, we can spot some tendencies, but functions can be many. Despite the Saka-reduced presence in the period, they are recorded to have been deployed in force at Gaugamela, comprising numerous cavalry units, including 1,000 Dahae, was a people living east of the Caspian Sea. They will later be part of the broader Parthian Confederacy. 2,000 Massagetai, a contingent of mounted archers explicitly referred to as Saka, and possibly also another not better known people, the Sakessinians, which of course refers to a sort of group of Sakas, but that we can't strongly identify just per se as such. So of course, as you understand, it's mostly all about like the Sakas in Achaemenid service. We will surely make videos about the Sakas in general, about their warfare, about their tribal lifestyle, their religion as well, because that's very interesting as far as we understand. Here I gave you lots of pictures about the Sakas and how you can fundamentally conceive them, even from an iconographic point of view. We will surely make more videos about them. I don't know whether soon, however, still, and for improving, refining our understanding, we have to talk about their... I made actually videos about the Sakas, by the way. I didn't tell you at the beginning. I'll search them for you. I made videos about their army organization. So I was actually lying, unwillingly though, just forgetting that I had made a video about them before. Yeah, aside from the one Eurasian steppes warfare that includes the Kushans, the Parni, and the Macedons we came to fight them, I made a video about Sarmatian and Saka military organization. So I didn't lie, it's technically not just about the Sakas. However, as you understand from just the title, and as I said at the beginning, these peoples were not so different to the point of simply diversifying them more than much. There were differences, it's not like we don't know them, but the essence is pretty much shared and similar. Now, as far as Achaemenid units, Achaemenid warfare is of course like a whole universe on its own, as much as that empire was per se. We made here late Achaemenid army development. Yes, there we talk about more native Persian troops, more regular Achaemenid regulars to say better. And we talk about, and also the Achaemenid armored cavalry. So we really have to talk more about the infantry, typical infantry. The Achaemenid seated chariot, which is also a thing. In any case, you have the Ethiopian warrior, the Phoenician, Egyptian, and Lycian marines, the Arab warriors of the Achaemenid army, and now also the Saka warrior of the Achaemenid army. So we will keep replenishing these military historical units playlists with more. I think these are useful topics because at large they complete really a path that is otherwise a bit difficult to simply reconstruct. Like if you don't talk about the single instances, you may not actually get the relevance of individual forces, how they fought, why we care about them in the generality of their even just their material culture, for example. That's not random, right? In any case, for today I stop it here. I just hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it. Otherwise, leave a like or subscribe to my channel if you're interested in my upcoming content. As always, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.